Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, assalamu alaikum, depending on where in the world you're watching this from. Um, Oops, I've left some messages on there. Let me just take them off. Tonight, we have a very special guest coming to coming to share some insights with us. Um, the topic for today is somewhat of a deep topic. Um, you see, in life, we go through a lot of tests. We go through a lot of different circumstances where we're being tested. Sometimes we're tested physically, sometimes we're tested mentally, financially, we're tested by our families, we're tested by our friends, we're tested by our colleagues, bosses, business associates, clients, you name it, we're tested. Seldom do we come across people who are really tested to such a degree that everything they've known about their life, themselves even, comes into question. So tonight we're going to be talking about some very hard-hitting realities, and questioning our own values, character, and faith straight after this. Okay, it looks like we had some technical challenges earlier on this evening, but we're back. And today we have, as I mentioned earlier, we have a special guest with us. And today's topic is going to be something that has been alluded to in the past in previous conversations, and something that has been spoken about very briefly. But now has come the time to actually delve into this topic. And no other person I could think of would be better to discuss this with than Brother Moazzam Begg. So welcome, Assalamu alaikum, Brother Moazzam Begg.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Majid. My pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation this evening.
Likewise. You know what? It's first of all a pleasure to be hosting you, albeit remotely. I've got my bottle of water here. I can't offer you tea or coffee, and it looks like you're properly covered for this evening anyway, given the temperatures out there. But inshallah, we will meet at some point in reality and make that a reality. Brother Moazzam, I have come across your story before, many years ago. I've heard about things which happened in your past, and some of the challenges that you had faced. We have a mixed audience on this platform, and there are a lot of people who may not have heard about you or heard of you or know the stories surrounding your experiences. So just as an intro, and you can be as explicit as you like. I believe this is one of my clients, when he found out that I was going to be having a discussion with you, he said to me, do ask him that given that he moved into our neck of the woods in Borsley Green, which was worse, Borsley Green or Guantanamo Bay. So I think your journey initiated from Birmingham, being a Brummie lad, I suppose, as far as I know. Correct me if I'm wrong, but give us a bit of a background about how your life had taken a turn in 2001 and what led up to that.
Well, first, I think it's probably the first time I've ever been asked, is Bortley Green worse or Guantanamo? And one has to really think before he answers quite properly. And I still don't know what the answer is yet. But in all seriousness, I was born and raised in Birmingham, yes, in Spark Hill in particular. And during my teens, I was trying to rediscover my Islamic identity and trying to figure out who I was. I was part of a street gang. We fought skinheads on the Stratford roads. For those people who know that road, you would never imagine that neo-Nazis, the British movement, would march up and down those roads and say "Packies out" and all the other nasty things they used to say. But we were of the generation that said, we will fight back. We are British, whether they like it or not. And when they say "Go home, Packy," I'm going back home to Spark Hill. So that was the kind of backdrop to identity crises that existed. I used to go to a Jewish primary school. I went to a secondary school that had a Christian ethos, and at home, I'd come home and learn the Quran in the evening. So Torah, Quran, and Bible were all part of my kind of growing up learning. And interestingly, at that time, it wasn't the Muslims who were the quote unquote extremist terrorist community. It was, as you know, the Irish. And the Irish that lived in and around the areas where we lived were targeted through legislation, through racism, through the media, pretty much how we are today. So part of my rediscovery of my identity was about being, I felt I fit in. I felt that I fit in my identity as a Muslim because it spanned across different continents, different people and places. And so, sort of kind of because it's a long story and I've written a book about it and talked about it so many times. By the time my story reaches my age around in my 30s, my mid 30s, I traveled to Afghanistan with my wife and children to work on a project to build a school and wells. At the time, the Taliban was in charge.
Just to stop you there, just to kind of elaborate on something. You went to build schools in Afghanistan, wait for it, for girls, right?
Correct. Yes. Correct.
Yeah. I consider. I mean, I thought I'd highlight that because there have been always this kind of narrative being pushed about girls being suppressed and not having access to education.
Yeah, I mean, even to this day, there's a lot we can talk about that because in Guantanamo, a lot of the former leaders of the Taliban who were with us in Guantanamo are now leaders again and literally running the country. We can talk about the education system for women.
Right.
But one of the things that why I wanted to go was to be involved in a project to run a school for girls from the UK. I mean, began the project from the UK and to do it with a curriculum that's developed here, with playground equipment, with other schooling aids that we had to assist what was, after all, a war-torn country that had been ravaged by this and drought. So we built wells also up in the northwest regions, and I remained there until the US-led attacks after the 9/11 attacks. US invasion, we literally evacuated under US cruise missiles, carpet bombs, vacuum bombs, smart bombs, and every other kind of bomb you can think of was being dropped onto Afghanistan. And eventually I got to a house in Pakistan, which I'd taken up. My family originally from Pakistan anyway. And on the night of the 31st of January 2002, there was a knock on my door. I opened the door, faced a whole group of people, none of them uniformed, none of them identified, none of them with any ID cards or anything. And they put a gun to my head, put me onto the floor, tied my hands behind my back, put a hood over my head, and took me into the back of this vehicle. And my wife and children literally were inside the house while this was going on. And then inside the vehicle, there's two clearly Western-looking men, after they'd lifted my hood up, dressed as Pakistanis, but looking very white European. They turned out to be Americans, in fact, who said, "You can either answer our questions here or answer them in Guantanamo." And that was the beginning of my 3-year journey in the hands of the US military.
Wow. And I mean, that alone would freak a lot of people out, just having to deal with that kind of a trauma, or somebody who's who's in their minds gone over to do some humanitarian work, trying to escape a region which is being bombarded for the safety of their and their family, and then all of a sudden being found in the back of a van or a vehicle of some kind, strapped up. Which reminds me, have you prayed Maghrib?
I have, yes, of course.
Yeah, it reminds me of the conversation you once mentioned about the Libyan brother who you met at the back of the truck. Just share a little bit about that with us, because this
Yeah.
is fascinating. We have just heard Brother Moazzam talking about an incident which took place, which would shake the living daylights out of people. Yet there is somebody in the vehicle who's more concerned about whether they've prayed Maghrib or not.
Right. So this was not actually in this vehicle. This was afterwards. This was about
Okay.
3 weeks later when the Pakistanis. So I'm still in Pakistani custody in all of this time, and they're taking me back and forth to the Americans to be interrogated. But then the day when they decide to hand me over to the Americans, that's when the real trauma begins. So the trauma doesn't really begin with the Pakistanis. I mean,
Right.
it begins with being handed over to the Americans at an airport. So I'm hooded. I can sense there's other people next to me, and so I'm taken. Shoes are taken off. Anything that has laces or whatever that you could possibly use for whatever reason is removed. And then I was taken literally in the bowing position. So they force you, two soldiers. They loop their hands around you from behind, so that you're literally, your sockets feel like they're coming out of their shoulders, and they're pushing you down, and then taking you onto the runway, and then you hear all of these sounds. You're cognitive of all of these sounds and flashes. You can't see, of course, but you can make out the flashes and the muffled noises that you try to hear, that you try to make, and you hear from other prisoners screaming. You see American soldiers shouting and cursing in Arabic and Urdu and Pashto, Farsi, which sounds bizarre because they can't pronounce these words properly, but they think they're hurting us by this, and of course they're attempting to. The sounds of the engine, the roar of the engines, the dogs, big dogs around us. And in the midst of all of that, I'm taken onto this cargo aircraft and pushed down. Now I'm already shackled. My legs are shackled. My hands are cuffed behind my back, and I have a hood over my head. And then they put a strap over my legs. So I'm now cargo. I'm actually physically cargo. And then it gets a little quieter. And I know there's somebody next to me on my left-hand side, and I hear him say "Salam alaikum." I say "Wa alaikum salam." He speaks to me in Arabic, which I speak, and he's asked me where I'm from. I reply that I'm Pakistani. He says he's Libyan, and then he says the strangest thing that I was not expecting at all. In fact, I'd not thought about this from the point they took me to this. Were taking me to U.S. custody. Was that هل صليت صلاة المغرب? He says, have you prayed Maghrib prayer? And I'm thinking to myself, like, I don't even know. I can't remember whether I prayed my prayers before this. Because I'm worried about, am I going to live? Am I going to die? Where are they going to take me? I'm going to see my family again. What is happening next? This is terror. You're in a state of terror.
Yeah.
And if you thought that was bad enough, what happens next is even more terrifying. Because he says, I think the time for prayer has come. And I don't know how he would have known that, because we're both hooded. We can't see. We're both but to him, he's single-minded. He's single-minded. You know, the Quran says that prayers were fixed at their prescribed times, and that's what he's thinking. And I'm thinking to myself, this person has been sent, a divine intervention to remind me of that. He says, I say, okay, let's pray. You're on the left, you lead. Now, this is the really frightening part. At this moment, the American soldiers noticed that we're speaking. And obviously, we're not supposed to be speaking or conversing with one another. So one of the soldiers brings a knife and puts it right next to my neck. I feel the blade against my neck. And he says, if you speak again, I'll slit your throat. And at this moment, it's funny and it's also very empowering. At this moment, the brother next to me says, Allahu Akbar. And now we're in a state of prayer. I don't care. I mean, Slit my throat. I'm in a state of prayer now. In fact, be the best way to die would be like that.
Alhamdulillah.
So he
Yeah.
begins reciting Surah Al-Fatiha, the Lord's Prayer, the prayer of Al-Fatiha.
Mm,
And I'm in a state of prayer. I cannot disengage myself from that anymore.
sure.
And the soldier with the knife walks away, and that's it. As you can see, my neck's still intact.
Yeah, it's still there, and
So,
you're still with us. You
mhm.
know what? It kind of it helps us to put things into perspective a little bit. You know, when we make excuses for not praying for whatever reason, you know, a lot of us do, and you know, we think about all the reasons why we don't have the time, or the reasons why we can't pray, or whatever those excuses are. And when you hear stuff like this, it puts, you know, things into real perspective, thinking like, you know, you could be in that kind of a situation where that's it, you know, lights off any moment, yet still the brothers are there praying because it's prescribed at its time,
That's
and
right.
we pray
Yeah,
within it.
and you know what? The amazing thing about this, I've thought about this often, and I've managed to meet a lot of the former Libyan prisoners. I've been to Libya. I've met former prisoners who were living in Guantanamo, and I've asked each
Mm.
one of them, "Was it you? Was it you? Was it you?" And every one of them says no. And all the Libyans are now free from Guantanamo, so I'm still don't know who it was.
Still don't
There's a
know who
number
it
of
was.
but the amazing other thing is that we were coerced and we were in a state of traveling. So we didn't have to pray at that time. We could have prayed later and we would
Mm.
have been fine. It's just the
Yeah,
fact that he told me at that time, in the midst of all of that terror, here's something that you need to focus on.
yeah, yeah. SubhanAllah, you know, it kind of raises, you know, your hair on their ends when you hear this. And you mentioned just before you got there, you're Pakistani, you live in Britain, um, you went to a Jewish school. And one of the
Mhm.
questions I want to ask you is, how do you identify yourself? Because this is one of those conundrums which it baffles us at times, especially from within the migrant community. Like I often talk about this when we are here in the UK, and you mentioned the word "Paki" being called a Paki, having racist slurs thrown at you. We're here in the UK, and those of us who are from ethnic backgrounds or backgrounds of color, we have at some point or another been subjected to some kind of, at the very least, verbal abuse. So we're not fully British, in, you know, quote unquote, or perceived British whilst we're here. When we go back home, or whether it's Pakistan or wherever, the first thing you hear is the like the Agane, right? You know, the British are here and the Brits are here, so we're not fully accepted there either as one of their own. How do you identify yourself?
Well, I had a multitude of identities and multi-layered identities. One of the strange things is in when I was in U.S. custody, because I'm an English speaker, they they called me English. I say, "Hey, English," because the majority don't speak English. Majority of the prisoners. So
Ah,
even if it was somebody from Morocco who really didn't speak good English, they'd call him English. But for me, they'd say English, English 558. 558 was my number. Oh, wow, that's the first time in my life, born and raised in England, lived here, all this time, nobody's ever referred to me as English. Might call me
wow.
British passport, but English? Nah, that's
That's stretching it a bit, isn't it?
stretching a bit, yeah. So, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I started to connect to my Islamic identity. I went to Bosnia during the war several times. There were blonde-haired, blue-eyed Slavic people who had looked more like the people of indigenous people, as it were, of Britain, than they did like Muslims. Um,
Mm,
but I connected to them more. It was my religion, my faith. And, just take the word Caucasian. The
mm,
word Caucasian, denotes a white person, right? But
mm.
The Caucasus Mountains, where the Caucasian people originate from, are all Muslims.
Wow.
Chechnya, Ingushetia, Dagestan, Khabib, and all these guys, they're the original Caucasians. So this was, for me, it was beautiful that I could connect with those people across and still have a link with them. It doesn't matter what their color is.
Alhamdulillah. You know, on that note, I mean, I mean, I watched a couple of your documentaries. One was Taxi to the Dark Side, which was which won a few awards as well, if I'm right.
Yeah, it won the Oscar for this documentary in 2008. Yeah, yeah.
Wow. So those of you who haven't watched that, I would recommend you watch that. The other thing I watched was The Confession, which I had to pay for. And I did pay for it. I don't usually pay for stuff, and and for me to pay for something, it really needs to mean something. So I actually paid for that. You'd be pleased to know. And to be honest with you, The Confession, that made me emotional, especially seeing the interactions with not just yourself, but the way your family had to be dragged through this whole ordeal. God bless your father himself, and watching him address the public or the audience, that really made me emotional. I mean, how without with going through all this, how did your family cope with it? I mean, you would only have known how they coped with it once you'd met them afterwards. But for somebody who themselves is being wrongfully detained and going through a lot of torture himself, I mean, to some extent, your emotions would probably have had to switch off.
Yeah, so I mean, there was a very, very difficult time in which, when I was held in Bagram by the Americans, where they subjected me to the sounds of a woman screaming in the next cell, which they led me to believe was my wife being the tortured. Now, this is the FBI, the so-called FBI good guys, and the
Mm,
CIA not so good guys, but they're working together, and they're threatening. They're telling me, if you don't cooperate, we're going to send you to Egypt or to Syria. Why would you send me to Syria? I thought you had bad relations with the Assad regime, but clearly, when
mm,
it comes to this war on terror, you're all working together. So they bought photographs that they'd seized from my house of my children, my family, and said, "Where do you think they are right now? What do you think happened to them to the night when we took them away?" So they're playing on this. They didn't have my wife in custody. Alhamdulillah, they didn't, but they had somebody's wife in custody, or somebody's daughter, somebody's, because there was a woman screaming there, and I tried my best to try to find out who that was. But the other aspects, of course, is that I didn't know. I didn't know what my when my son was born. My son was born about 5 or 6 months after I was taken into custody. I didn't even know he was a son. I got a message from the Red Cross to say a child is born, mother and baby safe. That's it. I had no idea who he was, and I didn't see him until he was 3 years old. And I am lucky and fortunate, because I know people, including one of my closest friends, who was held in Guantanamo for 14 years without charge or trial. He came
wow.
home to see his youngest son, Faris, at the age of 14, almost 15 years old, for the first time in his life. And this wasn't in some kind of deepest, darkest Africa or Asia. This was in Battersea in London. That's where he's from. And there's a kid and these other children who've grown up, his other children who were small, grown up in London, who've had this experience, that their father was held by the most powerful and closest ally of the United Kingdom without charge or trial for 14 years.
I don't know. Well, Muslim, we have a lot of mixed audience who watch these programs and watch this podcast and who are connected with me. Some of them are coaches, some of them are mentors, counselors, and so on and so forth. Um, and sometimes it helps that when they say a problem shared is a problem halved, or when you hear about somebody else's ordeals or the challenges they have gone through, somehow it makes your own challenges feel that little bit smaller and easier to cope with. If I could just ask you quite candidly, what were the most difficult times that you'd faced in Guantanamo?
I think one of the most difficult was the one that I've mentioned already, in relation to the belief that, or leading me to believe, that my wife is being tortured next.
This is, if I'm correct, this is what led to that false confession.
Right,
uh,
right. So
coerced
this was what
confession.
yeah, this is eventually what led to it, which was in Guantanamo several months later. But yes, these are the people who began that process.
Mm,
Um, there was, of course, there's that witnessing. So Taxi to the Dark Side is all about a taxi driver who I saw murdered by American soldiers. And witnessing murder, it probably doesn't get worse than witnessing murder. And
mm,
I saw 2 people killed. And this story is about taxi driver called Dilawar, who was an innocent Afghan taxi driver who was beaten to within inches of his life in front of me, and then taken away and then put in a different cell, and then killed by soldiers who were on duty that night. Um, in This is around This is around January 2003. So I'd been in Bagram for almost a year. This is before I was sent to Guantanamo. And, you know, the real bizarre thing about this murder, really bizarre, think about this. I'm sent to Camp Echo in Guantanamo, where I'm held for about a year before this happens. And one day, two interrogators come in. They've not come to interrogate me. They want to ask a question. They bring in a photograph of the dead body of this taxi driver. They said, "Can you recognize him?" I said, "Yeah, he was in my cell. He was. I remember him because they used to hang him up and punch him." And this was the first confirmation that he was dead. There was rumors that he was dead, but this was the first confirmation. So I see this photograph of him that they bring. And then they bring the photographs of the soldiers who were on duty that night. And they said, "Could you identify who was there?" And I said, "This guy and this guy and this guy and this woman." And then they said, "Would you be prepared to be a witness for the prosecution in any potential case against these guys?" I said, "Yeah, sure. But how are you going to do that? You're going to take me by force? Like, am I going to come coerced? How do you guys do law? How does America interpret law? I know you have habeas corpus and Magna Carta as part of your constitutions, but how are you going to do that? I've been here for 2.5 years without charge." And eventually I was released, and some of the soldiers involved in those abuses actually contacted me. And they were released. They got dishonorable discharges and demotions and whatever. And that was it for murder. So that's probably the worst thing I've ever witnessed. And probably the most heartbreaking thing, if you want to call it that, is it was an affirmation that I really am a Paki.
Yeah.
I'm not British. And that was when I saw agents of MI5, one of whom had come to my house once, years before, and that was the real reason why I ended up in Guantanamo to begin with.
This is your mate Andrew, isn't it?
This is Andrew. This is Andrew, who comes to my house 3 years before about the case of an individual, a Moroccan guy who'd been beaten and tortured, and asked me to get him an international lawyer. So Andrew, the same guy had sat in my house, in my room, I'd offered him tea, is now there repeatedly while guns are pointed to my head, while people are being murdered. And I'm a British citizen. And I say, "What can you do to help me?" He said, "Nothing. All I can do is tell you to cooperate with the Americans." I said, "I'm not an American. I'm British." And of course, so that probably is where just kind of reaffirmed to me that I really, in the eyes of these people, I'm not British.
Wow. So now, when you were released and you came out and you've had a journey since then, you are free, are you not?
Freedom is relative. Yes, I am free. I'm free. And you know, the naysayers will say, "Well, you could be in Pakistan and you could be in Saudi Arabia, you could be in this country, and they wouldn't treat you as." I said, "Yeah, sure, of course, but I'm British. I keep telling you, I'm born and raised in Britain. You keep telling me that I don't have equal rights. Yeah, I'm free, but freedom has come at a cost. Sometimes my passport being removed. Sometimes, if I do have my passport, then they're being stopped at airports, particularly when I'm in the UK, for hours on end, being refused entry into different countries, having bank accounts repeatedly closed. So there's a price that comes with this freedom. It's not a freedom that a normal person would expect. But I think part of this is because I've taken on the state. I haven't just capitulated. I haven't just laid down. I haven't just said, "Thank you very much for bringing me back home. I'm going to hold you to account. You were involved not just in the murder of the people that I saw. You were involved in the murder of thousands of people. The invasion of Iraq, especially, was based upon the tortured testimony of prisoners who were held in the same place where I was, where they were forced to give confessions. Those confessions themselves became the justifications to invade Iraq. So I'm going to hold you to account, and I don't care what you try to do to me, because you've tried and it didn't work."
Yeah, wow. I mean, we have the European Convention on Human Rights Acts, and we talk about the rights of individuals, the right to do X, the right to do Y. Somehow, some of these rights are dissolved. I mean, one of the things that, if you look at some of the other states, which they so proudly talk about when it comes to Britain, is the rule of law, that everybody is subjected to the same law, no matter who you are, and which position you're in. And Imran Khan, former Prime Minister of Pakistan, is repeating that I mean, rightfully so. Obviously, the rule of law in Pakistan is somewhat different to the rule of law here. I guess there are levels to that as well. But how do you unpack that now that I mean, I want to know a little bit more about Cage and the work that Cage does, and the way that these rights are applied towards individuals and suspected individuals of a certain nature.
So I mean, you made the point of Pakistan because it's very important. There's a strong correlation between Britain and the rest of the world when it comes to law. For example, the concept of habeas corpus, the concept of Magna Carta, this ancient writ that is so powerful that it resonates in the constitutions of America and Australia and Uganda and India and so forth. And that is the person, to no person shall a justice be delayed or denied, except that they will be judged by a court of their peers. And that's really nice in writing. And that's how Britain says, with a straight face, that we are more civilized than other countries because of our adherence to the rule of law. Now, put that to the test. Britain has been repeatedly, I mean, it happened at the time of the IRA. We've mentioned them before. They were interned. There was internments, people being interned without charge or trial under emergency legislation. After 9/11, there was emergency legislation here in the UK. And the first people they arrested in the UK and held without charge or trial were North African and Middle Eastern men. 16 of them in high security Belmarsh prison. I know because we have the same lawyer, and this is part of the work that we've been doing. Then there was a series of control orders where people were put essentially under house arrest, though there was no evidence that proved that they'd committed a crime. They couldn't challenge the evidence because they couldn't see it, and they were using a type of evidence that is closed or secret. So you can't challenge that evidence. Then there has been a whole series of anti-terror legislations across almost 2 decades, which is in de facto terms almost only targeted Muslims. From the Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act, where people are stopped, disproportionately Muslims are stopped at ports of entry and exit and questioned, digital DNA taken from them, swabs, photographs, and if you refuse to answer questions, and if you refuse to submit any of those things, then you could be arrested and prosecuted as a terrorist, even though you weren't arrested for terrorism. That's a shocking law.
Yeah.
But one study by Cambridge University found that 88% of people stopped under Schedule 7 were Muslims, and were about 5% of the entire population. So Guantanamo opened this massive door to me, whereby I started looking at legislation, not just here, but across the world. And there's a causal pattern whereby it is easy for any nation, once they use the term Muslims, terrorists, extremists, national security, that national security apparatus then is used to ride roughshod over every so-called right or liberty that we claim to have. And most recently, there's one now that will give MI5 and the security services immunity from being involved in serious crimes, including murder, rape, and torture. So this is the level, and that's the discretion of those in power. And this is passed into law, and most people don't know about it because they think the government can do no wrong in this regard. And they are so wrong about that.
Yeah, I mean, and that leads us on to the question of, values and morality and, ethics. And, as people who ascribe ourselves to a theology, we have a set of rules, laws, values, ethics, morals, which we abide by. Man-made law obviously has evolved over time, and it's never stayed the same. But where there is a conflict, how do you deal with that?
It's very difficult. I mean, by and large, I would say, because Britain and Europe in general are pluralistic societies, and Britain, with all my criticisms of it in comparison to many other places, including within Western Europe, is far better for Muslims and far better for us. And one of the places where we can operate is because of this strong sense within the country to adhere to the rule of law. Not to say that every law is good, and not that adhering to that law is good. Slavery at one time was a law, and that didn't mean that it's a good thing to adhere to. You have to break and repeal some of those laws, and I think some of the terrorism laws require that opposition. But at least there's a system here whereby you can people believe in that system, and whether they might be on the right or the left of politics, we are able to utilize that and to get our rights because there's no other way to do them. On the other hand, when there's a clash between ideals, our ideals and beliefs and our laws as Muslims, and what's being enforced in the country, then we have to be prepared to take the hit. There's no other way around it. If there's a particular thing that I can't give I can give an example, but if that is if that is against our religion, then we have to openly say it's against our religion. And whatever consequences come, that's fine. We should be prepared to accept them. After all, the most celebrated man on the planet in recent times was a convicted terrorist called Nelson Mandela, who went to prison for in a country that was run by people of white European origin, terrorism. And we today celebrate him as one of the greatest statesmen in the world. So it doesn't matter what people say today. It's what your principles are and whether you're prepared to hold onto them and whether you're prepared to sacrifice for them.
Yeah, it reminds me of something which Andrew Tate said when he embraced Islam. I'm sure you've heard of him. Somebody asked him about Islam, and he says, well, the reason I'm drawn towards Islam is because it's an intolerant religion, meaning not that it's intolerant full stop, but it doesn't tolerate things that don't ascribe towards the faith, so there are clear boundaries, because as we know that the deen is al-qayyim, it's upright, with an established code. And some would argue that that's a slap on the face of people who try to become liberal in inverted commas, or try to dilute the faith just to appease people around them. And then there's a saying, isn't there? If you're not tolerant, if you're tolerant of everything, you don't stand for anything.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's very similar to what Malcolm X said. If you don't stand for something, you'll fall for everything. And this is exactly why Islam is attractive to people, because it is a religion of principles. And it is not ever evolving. Yes, principles of that some legal principles or jurisprudential issues may be able to be navigated because of modernity, but its principles will never change. And this, you can see this argument that's coming through often with people wanting to transition, change sexual gender, and so forth. We've seen that happen so often, and people very, very confused. But the one group of people that's not confused about it is the Muslims, and they're holding their ground, whether it's here or whether it's in Michigan. It's just or whether it's in Qatar.
Qatar, I was going to mention
wherever it is, the Muslims are holding their ground. And I think the rest of the world, who are totally confused. I mean, there was this one question that which I thought was laughably responded to by somebody on Twitter. He said, well, where are all the women in Qatar? Where are all your rights in Qatar? And they responded by saying, well, you've lost the right to decide who a man or a woman is in the West because you don't know. It's not based upon your genetics and based upon your biology. It's based upon how you feel. And that response from a local Qatari was, I think, told everything we need to know about the way, the direction in which the West has fallen, unfortunately. And there are people within the West who see the lunacy of this and see Muslims as holding their ground. And I think that that's one reason Muslims in the West should be seen as a protector of rights and a protector of morals and values.
Yeah, because a lot of the times we get criticized for a better term, lack of integration, and that we're not integrating properly. We have, pockets of our own communities. We know, there have been so many studies done about communities and Maslow's hierarchy of needs. One of the highest needs is of belonging to a community. But just because, I think as a community, we are very well integrated. Integration doesn't mean assimilation. We don't have to assimilate what we're integrated into. So I think most just as every other Brit, every person in England is integrated within a community. There are the extended communities, and we're all in the same part.
In fact, if you go to many parts of Spain and elsewhere, and you meet some of the British expat communities, there you'll find that integration is not really high up on the list of British values when you're abroad. And so I think for us, yeah, we do integrate. The very fact that we're speaking English, you wouldn't be able to tell if you couldn't see our faces. You wouldn't be able to tell whether we're Asian or not, of which origin. So
Mm,
our integration goes back much further. There's hundreds of words from the Arabic and Islamic lexicon that originate in some words in the Quran and some words from the Arabic language. The word alcohol comes from the Quran, al-ghawl, which is heavy-headedness.
mm,
Admiral comes from the Arabic Amir al-Bihar, which means the leader of the of the navy. Magazine from Makhazin, place of storage. There's hundreds of words. So the integrations already happened hundreds of years ago, whether you like it or not.
mm. Talking about British values, uh, similar to some of the changes in the legal system, there have been implementation and interventions introduced within the country, such as prevent. And these are things, these are strategies or interventions which have had their own challenges in being accepted within the communities, because as we know, a lot of the times most of the people who were subjected to the prevent strategy were the Muslim community. And I surprisingly, because I, as a governor at a school, I have to do training with child protection and so on and so forth, and preventers training is a part of that. And I was once sitting, and first time I did this training, I was sat there with all these preconceived answers that were going to be popping out, and the trainer, who was training us on the subject, was asking a question, well, asking the questions related to, who do you think we are referring to when we talk about terrorism, or people who commit some kind of atrocities of this nature? And without surprise, most people would describe them as the Asian or Arabs with turbans shouting Allahu Akbar, right? And then she corrected them. She says, actually, most of the people who have been arrested for committing a crime under this are white British Caucasians, and
Mm.
obviously within the country, statistically.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the other problem with prevent, of course, I mean, there's just too many problems. It's not just that it's been targeting Muslims, it's been targeting Muslims under a certain age. So, under the age of 18, under the age of 15, the largest figures um, were of children at school, at primary school age, even at nurseries. I think this changed a little bit somewhat, but in the early days, that's what it was all about. And it was so toxic that
Mm.
actual universities took stances saying that we refuse to cooperate with prevent. Universities like SOAS, like Edinburgh, Goldsmiths, and so many others, because they said that this now is going to be a spying program um, on our students, and it's going to damage our relationship with the students. Because how do I know? I've been trained as a teacher or as a lecturer and so forth in this particular field. How do I know how to recognize what could be an extremist when you can't even define in law what an
Yeah.
extremist is? Gandhi was an extremist at some point. They have a
Yeah.
statue of him outside the parliament now, as they do of
One
Mandela.
man's terrorist, another man's freedom fighter,
Yeah,
isn't it?
so I think you can't legislate this stuff. What you can try to do is to say that if this is enough, goodness knows, Britain has more laws than any other country when it comes to crime and punishment. You have ample laws to deal with the problem. And you know what? Sorry, I just want to mention this.
Yeah.
Prevent. The greatest threat of terrorism, where it comes from, to this day, where the largest amount of weapons, training, history, and grievance is in the whole of the UK. Northern Ireland. Northern
Oh,
Ireland.
okay.
And do you know where there is no prevent? Northern Ireland. Because none of the communities there, not the Catholics or the Protestants or the loyalists and nationalists, will accept either side of the divide being described as terrorists. They won't accept
Wow.
it. So there is no prevent there. It's unworkable. It would break the Good Friday Agreement if they even attempted to do so. And
Wow.
that's the irony, because it's only on mainland UK, England, Wales, and Scotland.
What do you make of people who, even from within the Muslim community, who apply for becoming a part of the prevent strategy, for official roles and taking funding, um, I suppose, with a mask of, uh, you know, anti kind of, or fighting against extremism, but being a part of the whole strategy? What do you make of all that?
I've met people. Look, I agreed with the concept of
Mm,
preventing violence on the streets of Britain from whoever does it, however they do it. If they're from our community, we need to be the first ones to stop it. Sure, no problem. But preventing violent extremism and prevent isn't about that.
mm,
In fact, one of the things I discussed with some of the prevents practitioners was that I said, well, can you prove to me what's your greatest success stories? How many lives have you saved? You certainly didn't save any of the lives in Manchester or
mm.
London Bridge. Those other places, even though those people had been referred to prevent officers. Khurram Butt, for example, the brother of one of the the brother of Khurram Butt, who was one of the attackers on London Bridge, who killed 8 people in 2018. His own brother worked for Prevent and received £10,000 from the police and Prevent to help
Wow.
to de-radicalize his own brother. They couldn't. So I asked them, what is your success? How do you mark success? And they said, we stopped 150 people going to Syria. I said, well, is Prevent about stopping people
People going to
taking life
Syria.
in Syria, or is it about Britain? And they said both. I said, really? So why'd you stop at Syria? Why not Egypt and Pakistan and China and elsewhere? Why just Syria? What do you have about saving lives of the Assad regime in Syria? And they couldn't answer. Of course, they were stuck. I said, you can't present that as a victory that you didn't save any lives here.
Mm,
So unfortunately, we just don't have enough people arguing the basics of. But Prevent itself has become so toxic in the community.
mm.
So many people, leading academics, leading politicians, former people who used to work for Prevent have trashed it. That is the only place it should go is in the dustbin of history.
I think you're right, but at the same time, I think people picking up the pieces and wanting still a piece of the pie
Yeah.
are some
As
of
you know, it's highly discredited, and those who now
yeah.
work with it, the ordinary kid on the street who doesn't know about legislation and history can say, "Well, you're taking Prevent money," and I've seen
Mm,
this happen to many organizations. They won't do it
yeah.
in public. They'll do it hidden behind the scenes, and then say, "Oh, we're doing it for safeguarding, but about drugs and so forth." But not really. It's not about spying on the community, because the moment people get wind of it, they're finished.
Yeah, I remember going to Nottingham for a janaza once, and there was a big gathering, and there's a prominent imam there who's quite popular, and all of a sudden his speech switched from something else to safeguarding and anti-extremism, and I thought, whoa, what happened there? Then I noticed somebody had walked in, obviously an obviously non-Muslim individual walked in, sat on a chair and started taking notes, and after that he was greeting him, and I thought, okay, Prevent, it was
Yeah,
quite obvious. It was
yeah,
that obvious. I mean, yeah, make excuses, 70 excuses for your brother, but that one wasn't going to wash it with me on that particular day. On
yeah.
that note, when we're talking about state and the influence it has over us, and how we always support the good initiatives as long as they're executed in the proper manner. Um, Many years ago, and I say many years ago, I say about 6 or 7 years ago, somebody asked me if I was up for being nominated for a Queen's Award at the time. It was I don't know whether it was the OBE or the MBE, whichever one of the lower one was, and I declined, and they found it quite confusing why I would decline, because of some of the work that I'd done abroad, and what the results were of that, positive results and representing Britain and whatnot. And I thought, is it am I that much of a minority that people are confused about that? Have you ever come across this situation? Do you think there are still people out there who still care about um, their history and the colonial past, and how things like the foreign policy affects them personally because of association of a faith, and that's something that they care about? Do you come across some things like that?
I've come across. I mean, I know many people, Muslims and non-Muslims, who've received various awards, CBE, OBE, MBE, and so forth, and they're very close friends. Some of them are very close friends. They fight for the same rights that we do, and they just were awarded for a particular thing and felt like it was okay to take it at the time. Though I think now, in a more politicized world, it looks, especially post-war on terror, it doesn't look good.
Mm,
On the other hand, do I know people who've refused? Yes, I do. One of them is my lawyer and friend Gareth Pearce, who's the most celebrated human rights lawyer in the country. She represented the Irish, the Guildford Four, the Birmingham Six, as well as myself and a whole bunch of other Muslims, and still does to this day. She was offered the an a knighthood, as it were, or a damage, is it what they call it? And she refused. She refused on principle, exactly because of the connection to empire and what it would mean for her and her credibility. I know somebody else from Birmingham, famously poet laureate Benjamin Zephaniah, who refused again, famously. He said, and I quote, when they said they want to give him the a knighthood, he said, "Me knighthood? I thought up yours, mate." And that's exactly what he said. That's his response was. That's what his poetic response was. Up yours, mate. It's too connected to the destruction of the people that I come from, where I originate from, for me to be able to take something like that. And I'm still in the process of educating people about what empire did. So he's obviously written from a anti-colonial past and anti-colonial kind of narrative. But even as Muslims, I think it's on the one hand, it's very problematic, to say the least, especially a country that is engaged with repeated hot wars and cold wars on the Muslim world and in Muslim people. And until that is rectified, I don't think that's...
And it's not just the Muslims, to be fair. I mean, I've come across people who are from the African community, Black community, who have also thought about, thought deeply about whether they should accept it, and some haven't accepted it. One or two that I've come across accepted it, but they were quite vocal on the fact that, look, I wasn't sure whether I should accept it because of the colonial past. And I think for people who originate from those areas of the world, it would be more about the distant past. But for the Muslims, I think it's more of a recent past, especially given the interventions related to the foreign policy. And that, I suppose, that brings us on to the subject of things like poppies, wearing poppies. There are people, and I'm saying it's not just Muslims. Obviously, I don't want to make out that it's just Muslims who do this, but non-Muslims also refrain from wearing poppies just out of the fact that well, we're a democracy. Democracy, in its essence, means that everybody is a decision holder to a degree. You get elected to you elect your seniors to make decisions on your behalf. So you're all a part of these decisions. And if you're not a part of these decisions, you need to make yourselves vocal. So if you're not making yourselves vocal, it means, as silence is complicity, right? So, these people, when it comes to...
I mean, certainly there was this thing of, I remember when I was growing up, it's not yet poppy time and everybody was a poppy, and it's almost like as if if you don't wear it, there's something odd, something wrong with you. People are going to look at you. Now I think it's less so. There's a lot more conscientious people I've come across. But think of this: poppies people started wearing from the time of the First World War, and there were hundreds of thousands of Muslims and people from Africa and elsewhere who took part in these wars to the defense of empire. Some of them were press ganged and forced to go and fight, and told, for example, like the Afridi tribe in Afghanistan and Pakistan, they were told that they're fighting non-Muslims. And when they came to Mesopotamia and Iraq and found that they're fighting the Ottoman Empire, they actually physically got up and the entire tribe walked back. It's famously documented. My grandfather, my father's father, fought in the First World War in Europe. My father's father fought in World War II also. We had the medal. We've got his medals from the different campaigns in the Western Front. I can't remember a single time ever, if anybody would be celebrating and poppy, that anybody from those communities ever wore a poppy. This is very much a thing. You're a Muslim, even or whatever tradition you have, you celebrate the commemorate the dead in your way with prayers and so forth and so forth. But now, because your former colonial masters are now wearing these poppies and telling you that you have to wear them to commemorate and to be part of something, therefore you do it. I had this debate actually with a captain, a Muslim captain in the army, and he says, "Yeah, we wear them. We commemorate all of the dead." So I said, "Really? Are you commemorating the Taliban dead? Are you commemorating Bin Laden? Are you commemorating the Nazis? Are you commemorating everybody you fought? All of a sudden now you want to commemorate everybody's dead? That's complete nonsense. You're commemorating a particular side of history. And if we choose not to take part, that's our prerogative."
Yeah, and it's a side of history which has been suppressed, I suppose. Is, in throughout my history lessons, I don't remember it being so open and clear about all the things that the British Empire did, and the starvations that took place as a result. And I'm sure you know what I'm referring to, and all the other stuff that happened in the past, where so many these were some of the biggest atrocities, even till today, of that nature. And what the empire was built on, there's a dark history with Britain. It doesn't mean that we're anti-British. It means that we have to balance everything out. We're going to be putting ourselves on a higher moral pedestal. We've got to look at all sides of the coin, and think for ourselves a little bit more independently.
Some people would say, "Oh, this was the past, and let us celebrate our forefathers." I said, "Fine, go ahead. You have the right to do that. And in fact, you have the right to celebrate your military. But we also have a right to point out the crimes, the war crimes that were done in recent times. For example, since 1991 up until recently, up until 2016, Britain and America took part in the bombing of Iraq, and it was the longest consistent bombing campaign of any country that lasted 26 years. They never stopped bombing Iraq from 1991 until 2016. They were always bombing. How many people do you think died from that? And how many military men took part in that? And the most conservative estimates say about 1 million people. 1 million people were killed by British and American forces. That's just and so if that's not a war crime, if that's not something that should be held accountable for, considering that there were no weapons of mass destruction there, considering that you took apart and destabilized a sovereign state, who's holding you to account? Absolutely nobody. So if we say that we don't want to celebrate your celebration of their murder, which is that's what the soldiers did, then please allow us at least that.
Yeah, do you think, I mean, because we have these discussions in private groups, friends on WhatsApp groups, and there's always something that, brings us up into a bit of a heated discussion, or in-depth discussion. And one of the conversations which kind of repeatedly brings itself into the forefront is this issue of the divide and rule being so long drawn. When are people going to unite? And there's one obvious solution, which most Muslims, I would say, that I've never come across a Muslim who wouldn't want to have one ruler to unite all the ummah, all Muslims. Where do you think we fall short on that? Because you have some movements who have been banned in certain countries for even I don't know. I mean, I don't even know why they've been banned. I don't know that much about them to know the exact details, and this is just me displaying my ignorance a little bit here. But I think, as a concept, most Muslims would love the idea of being under one imam once again. Where do we fall short on convincing the masses on this?
Look, historically speaking, people connect that to the concept of empire. The last British Empire, the French and Napoleonic Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, the last united, as it were.
1922, I think it was.
1924, yeah. So people connect and say, "Oh, look, that's empire," and you're calling for a new type of colonialism and so forth. We can argue this in ways that are connected to now. Brexit is probably not a good example, but nonetheless, there was a European Union, and all of these countries. In fact, one of the reasons why there was a European Union is because Europe was at each other's throats for hundreds of years. I mean, literally, there was 100 years war between Britain and France, World War I, World War II. It wasn't World War I, World War II. It was European War I and European War II. This is where it was happening. And, like with everything else, it projected onto the rest of the world. But these people, based on all the different aspects of religion, Protestants and Catholics, different languages. Look in Britain, how many countries we have? We have 4 countries in Britain.
Yeah.
It's crazy, with all their own customs and cultures and history and language.
Yeah.
And they were constantly fighting one another. Scotland still wants separation.
Yeah.
Despite all that, they managed to come together. They managed to come together and call something a European Monetary Union, Economic Union, and, as you mentioned earlier on, the European Court of Human Rights. So Europe has its own paradigm of human rights. Islam, if you take the Muslim world, if you take it from Morocco all the way to Indonesia, between the Arab world, you've got one language. And you have a language that all Muslims at least can read and understand to some degree, more or less, in that region. you have far more historically and geographically that unites that world. But there's been a conscious attempt at making sure it's divided and at each other's throats. And that's why you find one of the worst wars are happening in the Muslim world. And unfortunately, that unity, if we were to have unity, even a unity that was based just on economics, it would be secret, and they cannot allow it. And unfortunately, that's been one of the attempts of Europe to continue to ensure that we remain disunited. But there's much more that will unite us than divides us. You can see that just Morocco winning the world, getting into the quarterfinals today. You know, why are Bangladeshis and Pakistanis rooting for them?
Yeah, exactly. And the fact that Saudi, despite the country shortcomings, when they won, you know, it's like for them that's the World Cup. It doesn't make any difference anymore. Even they had a national holiday the following day, and everybody was rooting for them.
Exactly. And so that all resonates with something that's deeply ingrained within Muslims across the world.
Well, that's an interesting point, because you mentioned financially, even if they were to unite financially, but that would be so dangerous for the world economy, because we know what happened as off the back of, well, again, whether you call them conspiracy theories or theories in general, when Gaddafi or Saddam, when they wanted to, there were, you know, rumors that they wanted to introduce their own currency and trade, and that being gold rather than the US dollar and everything. And that was one of the reasons why
that would upset the entire world economy, wouldn't it? Because you'd be trading on something that's real and not on falsities.
Has intrinsic value, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that will always be seen as some kind of a threat, and wherever it comes from. And the place that, as I said, you know, just look at the Arab world, look how divided that is, and yet look how united they are, historically speaking. You know, if you literally, you have one language, and in Europe you have 300.
Yeah,
you know, you've got hundreds of languages, and somehow they manage to unite. So it seems bizarre. It seems, you know, really insane that they can't unite, even on monetary terms, let alone military or other social issues.
Yeah. Well, the good old divide and rule strategy still works, doesn't it? You know, it's a working strategy. You know, it was even in you know, just general everyday life, I think we find challenges to unite on, and sometimes we can't bring ourselves to just accept a different point of view within our own. I mean, I'll give you an example. I do a lot of networking, and I mingle with business people. We have events and stuff like that. I've been personally boycotted by people and unfriended for not attending Christmas events, because it just doesn't fall with my, you know, line of thought, you know, and what I ascribe to. Yet there are people on the other side who, you know, are the examples that I'm given. You know, look at such a person. You know, if you don't want to drink, don't drink, but come to it's not about the drink, you know, it's about the whole concept. Yeah, the environment, the theological concept of what is being celebrated, and, you know, going back to monotheism. Whereas I'm being given examples constantly of people who serve alcohol at events, or, you know, do business in using with the use of interest and stuff like that. What would you advise people in the general populace about how to kind of, because you've been through a lot, I'm sure coming out of there, it's strengthened your faith and your iman to do things in a certain way, and the general public haven't been to you know, through extreme experiences like you have. But they're saying that neither have I've been through some experiences, but not as extreme. But, you know, what advice would you give to people in the general population, and how to conduct themselves and be, you know, try to be more representative of the Islamic faith?
I think one of the things for us, if we compare ourselves to the rest of the Muslim world, most of them don't have to face those issues. They don't have to worry about being invited to a Christmas party or alcohol infused parties, and so forth, or mixing with the opposite sex in an inappropriate way, and all of that sort of, because they're in the Muslim world. Then that's not a challenge they face. There are other challenges for them. But we are here essentially in this society. This society accepts us generally for who we are and allows us to do whatever, you know, generally what we want to do. And so the argument is that, well, if we allow you, then you should be showing reciprocation towards us. And we say that, of course, we do. but not at the expense of our identity and our faith and our principles. We don't do that because we would have nothing left than otherwise. And we would have capitulated and destroyed ourselves, unfortunately, like many other groups of people around the world have. And we can be respectful. We can be tolerant just as much as the people are towards us. In fact, we can be welcoming. One thing you can see from Qatar is the welcome. It's part of an Islamic identity to be hospitable to people more than others are, and that's very evident from the behavior of people there. So when we're faced with situations where we are asked to take part in things that are prohibited for us, then that has to take precedence. That has to be our. And I will say this as somebody who's interacted a lot after I came back from Guantanamo with many human rights organizations and situations whereby there were hardly any Muslims around at all. I mean, one of the first persons I met I went to this Amnesty gathering. He literally got a beer and he gave it to me. He said, "Oh, this is for you." I said, "I'm a Muslim. I don't drink." And then I thought to myself, well, I shouldn't have been in this environment to begin with. I didn't know it was going to be there. And I thought, okay, I got to check myself next time. So I did a talk in another place in a university, and they're having drinks afterwards. And I contacted one of the organizers, and they said there's going to be drinks here. I said, well, I can't be there then. I can't come to the place where there's going to be drinks and sit around and feel like it's normal. I can't normalize it. And she said, I've told them that went back and said, I've told them there will be alcohol. Either you have the alcohol or you have Moazzam. You can't have both. So they had to get rid of the alcohol. And she understood. And I think sometimes people they might not agree, but there's always benefits from we don't expect them. In Qatar is another example, right? They've been saying now it's far safer for women, for female supporters, for female fans to be present at the matches because of the lack of alcohol there. And so they start to see benefits. People will see them because they haven't tried them, and all they can do is what they've been told to do. And we say we come with a different message. Try it. Maybe ours is based upon a principle, not because we don't like it personally. And try it, see how it goes.
Well, yeah, this is the difference between believing in a religion for its ritualistic acts, as opposed to living it through the religion practically. I think a lot of us have diluted or resorted to just treating the religion as a religion rather than
it's a way of life. Yeah, there's some things we might not know why they happen, but for the most part, there is a benefit. There's a visible benefit that you can see on society, whether it's drinking, whether it's gambling, whether it's the use of usurious transactions. There's a practical, moral, ethical, and physical benefit for human beings.
100%, 100%. On the last moment, obviously we've gone over an hour now, and I'm just conscious of the time for you. I do genuinely appreciate you taking the time to join us this evening. If there's anything that you felt you wanted to get across, or just to round up the conversation, how would you do that?
No, it's been an absolutely fascinating, intelligent, thoughtful conversation, as I expected it would be. And so it's a pleasure to be able to speak to you. I think I would only simply say, for us, for whoever's watching, is that don't capitulate on your identity. Hold on to your principles. And in fact, that's what makes people, that's what makes society, that's what history remembers, that's what writes history. History isn't, as I say, one famous scholar, history was written in two colors. One in black which is the ink of the scholar, and the other is red, which is the blood of those who sacrificed for what their beliefs were. So let's at least try to be one of those.
Inshallah. Brother Moazzam, thank you very much. Jazakallah khair. Really appreciate you being with us today. Just stay on the line whilst we play the outro video. For everybody else, thank you for joining us. If you haven't already, do subscribe and press on that bell icon on YouTube. If not, on Facebook, do connect. And we'll have more interesting and meaningful conversations coming to you soon. For now, have a good night. Catch you soon.